All right, guys. I won't normally record this class, but I will today just because I recorded it on Monday and kind of framed it wrong, so I'll redo it. So for the people, I see some faces that I'm wondering if you guys were here on Monday or not. But this class is going to be the same thing on Mondays and Thursdays. And the video feed that I'm filming right now will be available to you guys afterwards as well. So if ever you're not feeling great or you want to switch around, like there's still a few spots left. Both classes aren't completely full. You could swap around. But if you've done the class on Monday, pretty much going to cover the same kind of subject today than on Monday. They're both hybrid classes in the sense that you're supposed to cover the theory at home, and then the first week kind of play it with less applications because there's less to talk about. But as we move throughout the semester, hopefully going to tied in with more real-world elements. So maybe there might be slight differences between the Monday and the Thursday class, but overall it's the same theme, the same kind of structure. So for the people who are here on Monday, if there's any, we talk about like production possibilities, frontier, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and make sure all of that's really clear, because those are the big subjects of the first part of this class, and those are the big subjects that are going to be on tomorrow's quiz. But overall, it's the same thing that repeats itself. Okay, so I'll try to limit myself to one big announcement, I guess, per week to you guys, like as a whole classroom in terms of emails, and I'll probably send one out just a little bit later today to kind of talk about like how I'm going to switch this video feed from the one I already posted. For some reason, it got posted late. It was set as hidden at first, so you guys weren't able to see it. But typically speaking, the video feed from the Monday class should be available on the Tuesday. So I record it. I have a mic on just to make the sound a little bit better, and then I kind of process it a little bit better so that if there's questions, sometimes I'll use like the camera mic just to make it sound a little bit better, or I'll try to repeat the questions. And that's pretty much it. Any questions on how this whole class is going to work out for the semester? No? So I'll clarify this in the group email as well, just in case some people aren't watching or aren't here right now. But a few things to note, the questions I've had so far, and I just want to clarify on, for the actual quizzes that you have to do for this class, are you allowed your notes or is it cheating? For those quizzes, I'm not there to verify whether you're looking at your notes or not at the same time. So you can use your notes, like it's not something that's unavailable to you. So just to keep it fair with everyone, like you have access to your notes as much as you want. And then I try to keep the time frame in a certain way that if you haven't done like the preparation for the week and the pre-week quizzes, well, you have the first week I only gave you 2 minutes. Now from afterwards I'm giving you like 3 minutes just in case it's a calculation question, so you have a bit more time. But overall, like in that 3 minute, maybe you won't have enough time to re-watch all the videos naturally or look at overall the notes. So I try to choose questions that I create to make sure that you guys do the work beforehand. So the goal behind the pre-week quizzes is for you guys to cover the material of that week that is to be prepared ahead of time, all the theory and everything else. So in this class, like if you look at any of the blocks that you'll see on Moodle, well, there'll be like week 1 block, and at the very bottom of the block, you'll have like the pre-week quiz. Well, you're supposed to have covered everything in that block before you get there. For now, I'm just basing it on theory, but eventually I might start pulling in the articles a little bit more. So I might just ask like a very quick question about one of the articles that's in there, just to make sure that you've looked at it. If you haven't, you'll try to scramble to find the answer as quickly as possible, but you might not be able to. They'll be pretty obvious. Like I'm not trying to get you guys with the hardest questions here. I'm just trying to make sure you're keeping afloat. And then when it comes to the online quizzes that will happen every second week roughly on Fridays, you have a 24-hour time block to answer it, and that relates to whatever chapter is written beside it. So I believe the first one's on like chapter 1, 2, and 32, 33, whatever you want to. Yeah.
Just a quick question actually about the. Apparently, for doing our exams, we're gonna have some kind of program that's able to like see us through the webcam, right?
Yeah. Proctorio.
Is there gonna be a possibility to also do it in person, the exam? Because in general, I honestly don't have a webcam anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm not paying $200 at Best Buy because those are the only ones left.
Yeah, I'm sure you can get access to a computer lab or anywhere else to be able to do the exam online that has a webcam. Like there's alternatives for sure. Like if you don't have a device that has a webcam, I'm sure the university will be able to figure out something for you. So I wouldn't worry about that. Like we could look into it a little bit more, but I'm pretty sure that if you want to do it at the lab or anywhere else, it can be done.
I was just curious to know if we could do the exam in person as well, like if that's going to be an option.
As far as I know, it isn't right now, but who knows? We'll have to look into it. Yeah, yeah, for sure. And in preparation with that kind of structure, we'll do at least the final quiz or maybe the 2 final quizzes with that structure, just so you guys get used to the whole method and that you're not freaking out the day of the final exam. So yeah, so these quizzes every second week or so, you'll see like whatever chapter is written beside it is the chapter that's going to be covered in that quiz. So that resembles more the kind of questions that you would get on the final exam. So all of that's really helpful in preparation for the final. Okay. Cool. Any questions? All right. So afterwards, I guess for every of these kind of like pre-week classes, after that we've covered all the material, that you've done your pre-week quiz and you come here, well, here the goal is kind of to clarify anything that's not clear to you. So maybe you understand like the basics about everything by looking at what's available to you, but there's certain things that you're just not grasping. Well, here's the time to kind of ask those questions. So I'll always kind of start the class by asking, does anyone have any questions on any of the material? And if you have any questions, that's going to kind of like set the direction of what the flow of the class will do. And then throughout the class, I might kind of like add little real world applications or just kind of completely switch to that. Okay. So based on the material that you were supposed to cover for this week, does anyone have any questions? Anything that needs clarifying? Okay. That's the most important part to clarify if there's anything, because afterwards, if I focus on certain themes, well, that's naturally still important, but I won't be looking at all the material. So if I focus, let's say now on production possibilities and on absolute and comparative advantage, well, that's some of the questions, some of the bigger questions might revolve around this, but there's still a lot of other topics that need to be understood throughout the chapter. Exogenous, endogenous variables, or whatever. Okay? No? Okay, so I'll move ahead. And with that quiz kind of question that came up with respect to the notes, I'd encourage you guys to do it without your notes, just as practice, because the final exam, you won't have access to your notes, and you need to pass the final exam to pass this class. So if you do really well throughout the whole semester because you're banking on your notes and you don't have your notes at the end, well, you might not pass this class even though you succeeded all the way through. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so moving on with some of the material that's been covered this class. So we talked about different types of production possibilities, and the question here is we've had 2 different shapes that we looked at for the production possibilities. So here in the notes, you could be thinking about like shirts and potatoes, but it could be just about anything else. Okay. And these are the 2 main ones that you'll see for production possibilities. Both have their advantages and disadvantages and how they respect, and they cover how things really work in reality, how it's simpler to compute afterwards. So the big difference between these 2 is that this one here, the trade-off between shirts and potatoes is constant. Okay, so this idea that we have a constant trade-off. So let's say I want to produce, let's say over here I have 100 pounds of potatoes, 50, 25, 75. Well, every time I want to produce an extra 25 pounds of potatoes, I'm giving up always the same amount of shirts. So this, we're talking about constant trade-off. Would be the non-technical way of noting this. But if we want to become more techie and use the lingo of microeconomics, we're talking about constant opportunity costs. Okay. Opportunity cost is a really big subject. We only cover it to a certain extent in this class. It's a pretty simple concept, but it's a concept that kind of follows you through pretty much your whole life, in the sense that your opportunity cost is always what you need to evaluate as your next best alternative when you make a decision. So when you guys decided to register here at Bishop's and to come here to study, your opportunity cost is your next best alternative. Whether that might be studying somewhere else, or it might be keeping your job that you used to have and keep working in that field. So some people can make a comeback after so many years in the workforce, come back to studying, while they were used to getting, I don't know, $40, $50, $60, $100,000 a year, and now they're coming back to study. Well, if you're earning $20,000, $30,000 a year versus $100,000 a year, your opportunity cost is greater when you're earning more in terms of dollar terms. Because in both cases, you had to quit your job to come back to study full time. And in one of those cases, the amount that you're giving up in terms of money is a lot larger than the other case. Your direct cost for studying here, if you're a Quebec resident or whatever local, is exactly the same in both scenarios, but it's that extra cost that is different. It's that time cost. Okay? And it's a very important thing to consider, because this opportunity cost evolves throughout your life. Right now, for you to study, and maybe when you graduate from here to say, hey, do I want to do a master's degree? Well, that extra year, what's really the cost involved? Well, I haven't started working. I'm not like high up in the company. I'm not earning a lot of money. I could get offered a job at maybe 40, 50, whatever, thousand a year, or I could study one more year and it might increase my job prospects. Your opportunity cost is quite low. But if you start working 10, 20 years or 15 years and then you decide, hey, I want to go back to do my master's. Well, if you're already an executive at a company and you're earning like six figures and like earning plenty of money, and you decide to go back to school, your cost is a lot higher. Okay? So it's just something to consider. Like for myself, over the course of the summer, I've been building my house myself, and it's been a fun experience because it's something I never expected to do myself, because I've never studied, I've never looked into construction beforehand, I never worked in that field at all. But at this point now, when I'm getting busy with classes and everything else, well, every time I ask myself, do I want to do this part of the work or hire someone out, I always have to ask myself, well, what's my time worth now? Over the summer, it was a little bit easier to kind of take time off of certain things to work on my house, but these days I'm just super swamped with everything that it's all my social life and all my kind of like sports life that's just completely disappearing because I'm so busy with both my career and building my house. So I have to kind of consider that and try to see, well, is it really worthwhile for me to do my ventilation myself? Is it really worthwhile for me to finish my plumbing myself? Or should I hire out? So it's something you have to ask yourself. So opportunity costs, in this case here, we see it as constant. And this, I would say it's simpler in the sense that we'll see that in this case here, I could say that for 25 potatoes, I need to give up 10 shirts, let's say. Well, since it's constant, that will always be the same amount. Okay? Whereas in this other scenario here, where this opportunity cost is increasing in this kind of like PPF curve that is bowed out from the origin, here we have an increasing opportunity cost. Okay. So you could see an increasing opportunity cost in a bunch of different situations, and I'll kind of highlight. I've talked a lot about this example in videos and stuff like that, so you might have seen this before, but I'll highlight what I mean relative to this. But then we could kind of discuss other kind of situations in your life. The whole idea here is that if all of you guys here were somehow my slaves, in the sense that I don't pay you guys to work, and I have you all working making shirts or potatoes. Even if you're paid, the story is the same. You are all my employees or my slaves. And this is how much shirts I could produce in a day if all of you guys are producing shirts. This is how many potatoes I could produce if you're all producing potatoes. And somewhere in the middle, as if some of you are producing shirts and some of you are producing potatoes. So the idea behind why we might have this curvature here is, let's say most of you are producing shirts and very few are producing potatoes. Well, if that is the situation, to say, and the last few people that are producing potatoes, you guys go to produce shirts, the increase in shirt production is probably going to be very small. And the reason for this is simply based on the fact that if most of the machines that help you produce shirts are used up, people are using them, most of the devices that help us produce shirts are being used, and you're just that extra person there that's making sure everything's tidy, that if someone needs wool, you bring them wool, and so on and so forth. Well, your contribution in terms of production is going to be quite minimal. You could also think about it as a kitchen that already has like a certain amount of ovens and everyone's kind of like has their station already, and you kind of jump in. Your contribution's probably going to be small. So this idea of increasing opportunity costs often is associated to situations where we have kind of a fixed space. So like all the machinery that I have for producing potatoes or shirts is a set amount. I don't have an infinite amount. So if I switch more people to one production, at one point those areas might get a little crowded and so on. But if I start from a scenario where everyone's producing shirts and I put some of you to produce potatoes, well, all of a sudden, like all the John Deeres and whatever are all available to you. And it's really easy for you to just drive around the machine and collect some of the potatoes, because there's just so many that are just getting like sprouting out of the ground, and you just have to collect them, and it's quite easy because like you could get like the biggest ones really quickly. Well, in that scenario there, I don't have to sacrifice many of the people that were in that shirt production. Those people were just getting the materials, and it's going to be able to increase my potato production a lot. So if I sacrifice a bit, I'll get a lot more. But as I go and I sacrifice that same amount, well, at some point, sacrificing that same quantity there is going to lead to a smaller increase in potato production. It's just going to be this amount compared to over here before. So we're going to have a situation where that increase is going to be smaller and smaller. And at the very end, I'm going to have to give up a lot of shirts being produced to producing a little bit more potatoes, because once again, at the very end, all the machines are being used and so on and so forth. So this is kind of our situation. In this situation here, you'd want to have people kind of producing a bit of both in a certain way. But you can see that this is harder to solve because we don't have this constant trade-off. So we're always in the situation of what's my trade-off for producing 10 more pounds of potatoes? Well, it's going to be maybe this amount of shirts. And then as you want to produce more and more potatoes, the amount of shirts you have to give up goes up and up and up. And that's why we say it's an increasing opportunity cost. Well, to solve for that, and the comparative advantage, absolute advantage scenario would be very, very hard because it's constantly changing. Whereas in this scenario here, it's pretty easy to solve because you always have that constant trade-off between the two. So we use this one more because this one would be like just too challenging to compute. Okay. Yeah. You could think about this in your life as well. Like there's three different things you might do. And if you try to just do one thing and you just put more time towards it, it doesn't mean you're going to become more efficient. Like for myself, like when I was doing my PhD and finishing my PhD and teaching here, I had my course prep to do and I had my thesis to finish. Well, if I said like, no more course prep, I'll just focus all my time on my thesis, at some point your brain gets saturated on that. You can't do much more. So it's just much easier for my brain to kind of do a bit of both. Same thing as just doing course prep, it's just too much. And that's why this summer I was having fun between construction work and prep work for this class and other classes. So yeah. Any questions with respect to these kind of like opportunity cost, constant versus increasing? Yeah.
So is lower opportunity cost better?
Depends how you see it, to be honest. Like lower opportunity costs for you, like when we'll be talking about trade, whoever has the lowest opportunity costs will be the one that should be producing that good. So in that case, it is better. But if I think about like what is my opportunity cost for traveling a year, like taking a sabbatical year off, I'm happy that my opportunity cost is greater than yours because that means that I have a good career and I'm making more money than you are right now. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just that that's why I often encourage you guys to go and travel as much as possible in these pre-COVID times. Right now it's a little bit harder, but or post-COVID times, because at this age you don't have as much of an opportunity cost of taking a whole year off to travel. Whereas you get older, like I have many friends that were like, when they were younger, they're like, oh, I'll travel later. And the older you get, the more responsibilities you might have or the more income you earn, the harder it is to travel and you end up not doing it. So I'd say do it when you can. So lower opportunity costs when it comes to trade, yes. It's the one that you should be producing. But otherwise, it's not something that you should definitely aspire to. Yeah. And last but not least, along these things here, the kind of quiz questions that you might see it sometimes revolves around different kind of points. So like you could have something outside here, something along the line, and something inside. So the different kind of categories, you might have a slightly different name, but over here you would have infeasible. And then along the curve, you would have efficient. And inside, you have inefficient. And this applies to this graph as well, on the curve, outside, inside. Okay, so why we say that any of these points along the curve are known as efficient points is because compared to the inefficient points here, if I start from an inefficient point over here, well, at an inefficient point, I could be producing more potatoes without producing less shirts because it's still feasible for me to do so. Or I could be producing more shirts without producing less potatoes because it's still feasible for me to do so. Or I could be producing more of both. And the reason why it's known as inefficient is because if all of you were my workers and I was at one of those points in the middle there, well, that means that some of you guys are slacking off. We're not producing as much as we can. However, when we're on this curve here, we are using all of our resources. The only way, let's say I start from this point and I call it point A, the only way from point A that I can produce more potatoes to come over here, let's say, is by producing less shirts. Because all of you guys are already doing a fantastic job, you're working your ass off and you're doing really good. And the only way that I could get more potatoes being produced is by taking some of you away and throwing you in the potato production. That's the only way. So these are all efficient points. Not saying that this point here is better than this point here or that they're all equal. They're not equal. You're producing different quantities. But at each of those points, you wouldn't be able to produce one more of the two goods without giving up some of the other ones. Whereas the inefficient points here, you can because some of people are slacking off. So if you wake up whoever's falling asleep on the job and get them to work, well, you could produce more. You weren't producing efficiently. And infeasible points are points that are just not attainable right now. If I double the amount of workers I have, yeah, I could probably get there. If I find a way to get a new technology that allows me to produce more potatoes or more shirts, it's going to start moving this around and so on. So some infeasible points might become feasible from a production standpoint, and then we're going to see with trade that some of these points that are infeasible for me to produce might be feasible for me to consume if I specialize and I trade afterwards. We can kind of like increase our consumption possibilities through proper specialization and trade. Last thing I want to cover along these lines here is the idea that if the technology I have for producing potatoes goes up, like I could produce potatoes more efficiently, it's easy to think that it's only going to help me produce more potatoes, but in reality, with an increase in technology of one or the other, I'm, in most cases, except one, can produce more of both goods. So let me explain. Let's say here, right now, I could only produce 100 units of potatoes per day. Now I have a technology that allows me to produce 150. In that case, the amount of shirts, if I only produce shirts, stays the same. The technology in producing shirts hasn't changed. So you're right to think that if there's only a technological improvement in potatoes, I can't produce more shirts. Fair. However, if I can produce 150 potatoes per day or this amount of shirts, well, now my production possibilities frontier would no longer be this curve here. It would be one like this. It would be a straight line as well. Let's just like kind of have a little curve at the end, but it would be a straight line production possibilities frontier. And yes, if I only produce shirts, I can't produce more than before, but let's say I start from a point here, point A. Well, all of a sudden, even though I have an improved technology in producing potatoes, I can move to this point here, call it point B, where I produce now more shirts and more potatoes than before. Why is that possible? Well, because the technology of potatoes is becoming more efficient. Maybe initially we had like half of you guys producing shirts, half of you guys producing potatoes. All of a sudden the technology in producing potatoes is better, so I only need to put a third of you guys towards producing potatoes, and I could put the other 2/3 towards producing shirts, which allows me to have more of both. Okay, so technological improvement in one could help consumption and production of the other one as well. Any questions here? Any questions on the other material? Anything that needs clarifying?
That's the only thing we can increase by technology or even by employees as well.
Yeah, technologies and employee. And you could think also not just necessarily technologies, but the machinery probably as well. So if I buy more tractors, it's going to shift things around as well. Rotate them. Yeah, those are the main things. Yeah. Cool. So go for it.
I was just going to ask, to reach those infeasible points, can you technically invest into more capital, so such as more machinery?
Yeah, that's what I just said. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so if there is a better technology, or that I buy like more John Deeres or like better John Deeres or whatever, it's going to start shifting this out for sure. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. All right, so let's move on to kind of like this trade example, a classic example that whether it's in a long answer question on the final exam or quiz kind of question or multiple choice, you're most probably going to see this question pop up at some point. Pretty much always makes it there. So let's go over it. When it comes to trade, there's going to be, like, I'll just kind of jot them really quickly on the side here, and then I'll kind of go through each of them. The questions that you'll often have, if it's a long answer question, I give it to you ahead of time. I don't really care. It's something I want you guys to know. There's going to be a question along the lines of who has absolute advantage and what and why. And there'll be a question on comparative advantage. And then there's going to be a question on who should produce what. And then there'll be a question on terms of trade limits. And then on acceptable trading term. So if this was a long answer question, that would be your A, B, C, D, and E of that question. Okay. And what's given to you is going to be pretty straightforward. Similar to the notes, there's a few examples in the notes. I'll just invent one off the top of my head now. We'll either go through one or two examples. If we go through two, the second one's going to be much quicker. And it's just going to go through all of these steps. Okay. So the goal behind all of this, why I think it's interesting to look at, is that it will help you understand that even if you have a country that's much more efficient than other countries and can produce everything better and faster, we'll talk about that in the relation to absolute advantage in a second here, it's still going to help you understand that even though you might have that kind of country compared to one that's much less productive, much more lazy or whatever, less educated, there's always going to be one country that has comparative advantage in producing one good and the other one and the other good. Okay? So, and the two good framework, like let's just keep it simple to we only produce two goods, it will always be the case. And as soon as you have that change in like this person has comparative advantage in this and this person has comparative advantage in that, there's always going to be a value in trading. Okay? There's always going to be some benefits to trading. So that's one of the first kind of like take-home messages I want to get through, is this idea that there's always going to be certain benefits to trade. The benefits may be very small, they might be very large, but there's always going to be benefits for both. It's false to think that trade, unless it's done with like a dictator in power and he's kind of screwing all his citizens over, trade from two different countries' standpoint is mutually beneficial. Then afterwards, the second part of this about talking about terms of trade and acceptable trading term is going to help us understand, well, what would be acceptable by both for both to benefit from this transaction, or at least not be worse off than before. And then this last discussion here revolves around the idea that maybe in practice, you might have a situation where one country or one individual has more bargaining power than the other, has more political power than the other. One is more desperate for this transaction to occur than the other. Something along those lines. If you think of Walmart as a business or any very large business, if someone wants to be able to sell through Walmart, well, they're able to negotiate a really big deal, because they know that if they get in, they get access to very large markets, a lot of selling points, and so on. So as soon as you're a big seller, you have a lot of bargaining power. If you think of certain economic kind of superpowers and so on, they might have a little bit more bargaining power than some countries that don't have as many alternatives. So all of that kind of like intuition can be highlighted through a very simple example or two. We'll kind of look at one or two here. Okay? So But at the end of the day, you still have to be able to run through it, so we'll kind of look at it now. So the two classic examples, like there's only two, like no matter how many numbers I invent, there's only two examples you'll ever see. And those two examples, it will be either one person is more efficient, can produce more of every good than the other, has absolute advantage in both, or you'll have a situation where one has absolute advantage in one and one has absolute advantage in the other. So I'll just kind of highlight two quick examples here on the board, and you guys tell me which one's which, and then you'll kind of see some shortcuts that you could go through if you have to answer this question. All right, so let's say me and a friend are both building our houses right now. And we're wondering, should we both just build our own things and do our own things, or should we help each other out? So there's like, I don't know, like there's two individuals. There's Terry, myself, and Tom. And the two things that we can produce in a given day is either to lay like gypsum boards, like sheetrock on the walls, or we can work on plumbing, whatever. Okay, so or build up 2x4s. I don't know. So here, let's say I could set like 5G is like 5 gypsum boards, not the speed of internet here that we're talking about. And in that given day, I could either lay, or that's pretty slow if I could only lay 5 in a day, but like 5 in a period of time, or I could do 10 something that relates to wood. Okay? And then you could have Tom, who could either do like, let's say, 10 gypsum boards or 3 pieces of wood. This is one example. I'll just kind of go through another example here with Jim and Joe. Well, Jim and Joe, we have someone here who can do like, let's say, 7 gyps or 7 wood, and Joe can do 4 gyps or 5 wood. These are two separate examples. Like, don't mix them all up together. We'll never have a situation where we're looking at 4 individuals, and it will always be 2 individuals, 2 goods, or 2 countries, 2 goods, whatever. We're always going for the simpler example. There's no point in going more complicated into this. Okay? So, yes, the numbers are different in both scenarios, but there's another key difference between it in terms of how we can interpret this, and from how to calculate it and how to go through A, B, C, D, and E, but also how to understand it from a real-world standpoint as well. So in this situation here versus this situation here, what's the big difference? So just look at this or this. Yeah.
In the second one, Jim has absolute advantage.
Mm-hmm.
In the first one, they can go competitive.
Okay, so you're right that in here, Jim has absolute advantage in both goods. Okay? But I guess here, just to make things clear, the definition of absolute advantage is whoever can produce more of good X with a certain period of time. So if we're comparing the same day or same hour or whatever between 2 individuals, 2 countries, it's whoever can produce most with a certain amount of time. So in this question here, there is still absolute advantage. It's just not one person that has both. Here we have Tom has absolute advantage in gyps because he can produce 10 in a day, and that's greater than 5. So if ever you're asked like why, well, just say, well, he can produce 10 in a day versus 5. 10's greater than 5. If you write it out like really shortly like this, I'll understand. because that's the way I always do it. And then we can see that Terry has absolute advantage in wood. Why? Because I could do 10 while he only does 3. Okay. Whereas over here, Jim has absolute advantage in both goods. Well, he has absolute advantage in gyps because 7 is greater than 4, and he also has absolute advantage in wood because 7 is greater than 5. Okay. Okay. So far we've only answered this part A, whatever. But answering this part A, let's just kind of go back to other questions that might not be this exact question on an exam, but there'll be some discussion questions that you might see in the textbook or that you might see on the final exam. It might not have this exact same format. Like, I'm not guaranteeing, I'm just saying, like, over 75% of my last years, like, I've been teaching this for 10 years now, this question has popped up. It doesn't mean it's gonna pop up. But if I think about this, other kind of questions or discussions that can arise, a question that I remember vaguely from the textbook relates to the idea that you might have a country that is more effective, more efficient at producing every good compared to another country. So let's say you compare Canada to a poor country that's less educated. I'm not going to name any country out there, but let's say there is a country and we think about a bunch of different things that can produce. A table, a chair, a projector, a screen, a pen, whatever. And every single one of them, on a daily basis, we can produce more of it per individual working, let's say. We can produce more. So the question that can follow is, if this country, Canada, can produce more than the other country at every single good, is there an incentive for both of the countries to trade? And the quick answer that some people might think is no. There isn't an incentive for these two individuals to trade. And that answer would be false, wouldn't be right. And we'll see why afterwards. In that situation here that we're talking about of a country or a company that could produce things much more efficiently in all categories than another country or company is this example here. And we'll see that even with this example, both can specialize in trade and be mutually beneficial. This example here is more straightforward to understand. One's more efficient at producing one good, and one's more efficient at producing the other good. So this one here, it's actually quicker to answer B and C. So if ever you have it in a quick multiple choice question and you don't have to answer D and E, you could actually answer this one really quickly. Okay? If I answer it, if I think about it really quickly, well, Tom has absolute advantage in gyps, Terry has absolute advantage in wood. Because they both have absolute advantage in one good, I know as well that Tom has comparative advantage in gyps and Terry has comparative advantage in wood. And I know that afterwards Tom should produce, so my part C, he should produce whatever he has comparative advantage, and Terry should produce wood. I didn't have to calculate opportunity costs here. I didn't have to dive into the numbers too deep, and I was able to answer A, B, and C. However, for part D and E, even though I haven't set it up yet, I will need to calculate opportunity costs. But that's the case if you have that kind of long question. So here I'm trying to relate it to real world framework, but I'm also trying to give you guys kind of like quick ways of calculating and figuring things out if ever time is of the essence on a quiz or anything else So it's just trying to make sure that if you understand it clearly, it can be really quick to answer. Okay? Whereas in this situation here, it's a little bit harder to figure out who has comparative advantage in gyps and who has comparative advantage in wood. So we'll kind of work this one out at first, and then you could do the same thing with this example as well. So here, how do I establish who has comparative advantage in producing a certain good? Well, who has comparative advantage in producing a certain good is who's giving up the least to produce it. Okay? That might sound weird when you think about it. But think about it any other way. Like, think about something that you're very productive at, whatever it may be. Okay? If you're very productive at something, you can produce a lot of it in a small amount of time. And if you could produce a lot of it in a small amount of time, the other things that you could produce with that given time is small. It's little. Versus someone who can't produce that good as efficiently as you, it's going to take him a lot longer. And with that lot longer time for him to produce the other thing, he might be able to produce a lot. Okay? So when I'm very good at something, I could do it very fast, could produce a lot, and the same time that I can produce little of something else. Okay? If I'm really good at making tables, I could probably do a lot in the same time as it takes to mow the lawn here of the sports field. Whereas someone here might be very slow at making tables. And in that same day, you'll only be able to produce one, whereas I produce 20. But both of us, we can mow the lawn pretty much the same speed. Okay? Maybe I'm a little faster, maybe I'm a little slower, but overall similar speed. So therefore, here my opportunity cost of producing one table, if I produce 20 in a day, is a 20th of the football field. Whereas if you can only produce one table or the football field, well, your opportunity cost of producing a table is a full football field. That's a lot more. So regardless of how you want to frame it and understand it, that's pretty much the way to see it. So here, who has the lowest opportunity cost has comparative advantage. So I need to establish opportunity cost. How can I do so? It doesn't matter which of the two goods I focus on. I'm going to put it on a one good framework. So here I could ask myself, opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wood, 1W. Well, in this case here, Jim, I know that Jim can produce 7 gyps, or 7 wood. Well, I want it on a per wood framework to be able to compare the two. So I'll divide both sides by 7. So therefore, I know that Jim has 1 gyps to 1 wood relationship. Whereas, I got that right. Whereas Joe, he can either produce 4 gyps or 5 wood. If I want it on a per wood basis, I need to divide both sides by 5. 4 divided by 5 is 0.8 or 4/5, which 0.8 will say per wood. So therefore, here, who is giving up the least amount of gypsum boards to producing 1 unit of wood? Joe. 0.8 is smaller than 1. So Joe's giving up less gyps. So he's not more efficient at gyps. He's more efficient at wood. Who has the lowest opportunity cost should have comparative advantage in that good. So here, Joe has comparative advantage in wood. Because he has the lowest opportunity cost. Okay. So whatever way you use, whether you remember that to have comparative advantage in a certain good, here we're talking about wood production and we're looking on a 1 unit of wood framework, you have to remember that you have the least opportunity cost, so the smallest amount of whatever else that you're giving up is one way to see it. Or the other example I gave with the field might be more applicable, might make more sense, but it might be a little bit of an extra step in your mind to kind of bring it back to this. The thing that I know for certain is that if Joe has comparative advantage in wood, Jim must have comparative advantage in gyps. It's impossible for one individual to have comparative advantage in both. If you give that as an answer on a final exam, you will definitely get 0 for that part. Okay. You cannot have comparative advantage in both goods. You can have absolute advantage in both goods, but you cannot have comparative advantage in both goods. Okay. All right. So in both cases, we went A, B, C so far. And now we have to establish D and E. So I'll just answer D and E for this one over here, because I already have the numbers there. It's easier to figure out. And then we could kind of think about the first example again if you want. So the terms of trade limits. And here, when you calculated the comparative advantage, I do not care whether you do it on a per wood framework or on a per gyps framework, as long as you understand that if one has comparative advantage in one, the other one has comparative advantage in the other. And at the end of the day, when we're going to do the acceptable terms of trade limits, like this amount of gyps per this amount of wood, that kind of range, you could easily flip it around and do the inverse if you wanted to and find the opposite for the other good. Regardless, if you do an exam and you say, I found this range and the other person found something different, but you were talking about wood and he was talking about gyps, it's totally normal. The two answers are correct and can be appropriate. So what are the terms of trade limits? So here, I focused on wood. So I'm going to set up a timeline that goes anywhere between 0 and infinity. It's a big timeline. And on that timeline, I need to say what I'm talking about. So am I talking about dollars, kilometers per hour? What am I talking about? Well, in this specific case, not talking about dollars or kilometers per hour, I am talking about this idea of, here I focused on wood, and I've already done all the work for calculating opportunity costs here in terms of wood. I won't start switching it over gypsum boards, or else I'm going to waste my time. So here I'm going to say this range here deals with gypsum boards per wood. What I mean by per wood is on a per 1 unit of wood framework. Because this is calculated on a per 1 unit of wood framework. This is calculated on a per 1 unit of wood framework. I'm going to keep that gypsum per 1 unit of wood framework. That way, the numbers I have there work. So on the exam, if ever this question pops up, the hint I'll give you is like, when I ask about this question, I'll say like, what quantity of X per quantity of Y is acceptable? Or what amount of motorcycles per computer is acceptable? And in your question, you might not have motorcycles and computer. You'll have like gypsum boards and wood. But it's just to give you guys a hint that you're talking about something relative to something else. So here, this is gyps per wood. We need to find the acceptable range. Well, here and here, we've established, well, I guess I forgot to establish it here, you always produce what you have comparative advantage in. So here, that means that Joe should be producing wood and Jim should be producing gypsum boards. So if I think about Joe here, okay, on what end of this timeline would he rather be? He is bringing wood to the table and he's getting gypsum boards in exchange. Would he rather be at this end here or at this end here? We haven't established an exact number, what his threshold amount is yet. But let's just think, is it at which end of the spectrum would he prefer to be? If you can understand that, then the rest should follow quite easily. So take a second and ask yourself this question. Which end of the spectrum? So here, just to give you guys an idea, if the spectrum's not clear for you, over here I could have like 0.5, and that would be 0.5 gypsum boards per wood would be the trading term. Like these guys are bartering between each other. It could be 1, it could be 5, it could be 10, it could be a million gypsum boards per wood. So I supply 1 unit of wood to you and you install 1,000 or 1,000,000 gypsum boards for me would be the trade. So for Joe, which of the two ends does he prefer to be? Yeah.
He'd prefer to be sort of on the infinite end. You want to get as much gypsum as possible for every unit of wood.
Exactly. So he's supplying the wood, and this is on a gypsum per wood framework. So definitely Joe wants to be somewhere over here. So Joe will want to be ideally as close to infinity as possible. Joe would accept this trade. I won't put the number right now, but because I just want you guys to understand the big concept. And I'll give you guys a hint. There's always going to be an overlap between the two. It has to be this way. Well, actually, let's talk about the threshold amount. What's the minimal amount of gypsum boards per unit of wood that Joe would require to accept a deal? And the minimum amount is something that makes him indifferent between trading or not trading. What's the minimum amount that he would need to trade? Would he accept 0.5 or 0.25 or 0.75? Would those be acceptable for him? And if your answer is no, why not? What's the first number that would be acceptable to him? Yeah?
Would it be 0.8 or greater?
Yeah, so here, if I look at this, it would have to be 0.8 or greater, because if he decided not to produce wood but to install gypsum boards himself, he would be able to install 0.8 for the same time period, the same amount of effort. So if you give him less than 0.8, he's not interested. You give him 0.5, he says, no deal. Instead of producing this wood and giving it to you so that you give me 0.5 gypsum boards, I'm going to install it myself, and in the same time period, I'll install 0.8. Not interested in your deal. But from 0.8 and on, we're talking. Okay? At 0.8, I'm not gaining anything. I'm not like super stoked on this trade, because pretty much every piece of wood that I produce and give it to you, you give me the exact same amount of the other good that I could produce myself in that same time frame. But as soon as you give me 1 or even 0.9 or 1 or 1.1, 1.2, now you're getting more than if you're producing it yourself. You're gaining from this trade. So in this whole range, Joe accepts, and that's his threshold amount. If we think on Jim, on the other hand, he has comparative advantage in producing gyps, and therefore he will produce gyps. So in this range format here, Jim doesn't want to be over here, because here is him giving 1,000 gypsum boards or whatever per unit of wood. He's not interested in giving a ton of them. He's interested in giving the least amount possible. If I could only mow like 2 meters of distance and you produce a table for me, I'd be happier than if I have to mow the whole campus. Okay? So he wants to give the least amount to get wood. So somewhere in this range here, Jim will accept. What I mean by Jim accepts, it's an acceptable range for him. If he can give the least amount of gypsum boards, he will accept this deal, this negotiation, this barter, whatever you want to call it. And what's the maximum amount that Jim will give up in terms of gyps to get 1 unit of wood? Yeah. Huh? 1, exactly. Very right. So 1 is what he will give up at the very most. If people are wondering still where we got 0.8 and 1, it's by looking at these opportunity costs. And that is why I said in this example here, which is more straightforward to answer A, B, and C, so if you only have to answer part of that through a multiple choice question, it should be very quick and snappy. But to keep on answering afterwards, you can do it. You just have to kind of slow down and go back to some of the steps that we did here, which consists of calculating opportunity costs. Consists of trying to figure out what is, on a 1 wood basis, how many units of gyps do I have to give up? Well, here I divide both sides by 10. So myself, I am giving up 1/2 or 0.5 gyps for 1 wood. And whereas this person here is giving up 3.33 gyps for 1 wood. Okay? All right. So you have to go back to that step, and then you would say you'd set up this timeline, and the acceptable range, instead of being 0.8 and 1, it would be 0.5 and 3.33. Would be that kind of range. So if you compare this 0.5 and 3.33 and 0.8 and 1, the range is bigger. And it makes sense for the range to be bigger when I'm much more efficient at one good than you. I have absolute advantage in that good, and you're much more efficient at the other good than I am. We really have a lot of incentive to trade in that situation. Think about bartering anything with your friends. If like you have to cook a meal and you have to do the dishes. If you're more or less the same in terms of speed of cooking the meal and doing the dishes, maybe one's just a little bit better than the other at both, so he has absolute advantage in both, but you're both kind of similar, well, the gains from trade will be kind of like minimal. The range will be small, and we'll see that leads to smaller gains from trade. But if one of you is like a really awesome chef and the other one's just like a crazy pot washer, like doing the Olympics, washing dishes, super quick at it, well, then you have a bigger difference between the two in terms of your relative productivity, so it's much more useful to having one do one thing and one do the other thing. Okay? So the bigger differences there is, the larger this range will be, and the larger the range will be, the more gains there can be from trade. But in both situations, there will always be this gain, mutual gains from trade area. Always, always, always. The only boring case that you will never see on an exam or quiz for myself that you do not have that range is if you had the same opportunity costs for both people. They don't have to be twins here. They just have to have the same opportunity cost. So if here I had 7 and 7 and here 5 and 5, well, they both have a 1G to 1W ratio. Same opportunity cost, so that range would be between 1 and infinity and 0 and 1, so it's only at 1 that's acceptable by both. No one's gaining from this trade. But I'll never put that example. Because why I won't put it is because it's a very limiting example. It's very rare. Like even if you and your friends are quite similar, one of you will be relatively faster in one thing than the other. Like you'll have a slight advantage. Like I remember working on papers when I was a student here, like I was very quick at pulling out ideas and getting really good arguments. Whereas a partner of mine, which we'd work together well, he'd be really good at making everything really clean and well written. I'm poor at those finishing touches. I'm really good at the rough stuff. So it gives us an idea of how can we gain from working together on this project. So ideally, you try to match up with some of those people. Okay. All right. So here are the acceptable trading terms is 0.8 to 1, and here was 0.5 to 3.33. And the last but not least question here relates to the acceptable trading term for both. So the range here, the terms of trade limits would be the range between 0.8 and 1 gypsum boards per wood. Be precise if this question is asked to you. Don't just say 0.8 to 1 because that doesn't tell me much. It just tells me numbers. If you tell me 0.8 to 1 gypsum boards per wood, then that's totally fine. It's a full sentence or a full kind of complete answer. And then the thing with this is the acceptable trading term. You need to give me any number in between the two. I don't really care which one you do, but you have to give me one in between. If you say 0.8 or you say 1, this is normally a question that says acceptable trading term for both to gain. That's what I was missing. You cannot choose 0.8 or 1 because at 0.8 or 1, one of the two is not gaining from this trade. He's not losing. He's still doing it. But at 0.8, Joe is not gaining because for every units of wood, he's only getting 0.8 gypsum boards. And if he were to do it himself, he would get 0.8 as well. So he's not gaining anything from this trade. But you give him 0.81, 0.82, 0.9, he's going to gain. And then the final kind of illustration here with respect to real life examples that I would say is, as I mentioned before, you might have a situation that either you're dealing with a really big company or stronger country that has more political pressure, power, and everything else. You might have a trading term that advantages one person more than the other. If here, Joe was the person who was the person with the most bargaining power, Jim's desperate to get a deal. Joe isn't. Joe's cool as a cucumber. So if you have that situation, where would this trading term be? Give me a number of like a trading term that would be a situation that both would gain, but definitely Joe's gaining more than Jim. So it has to be between 0.8 and 1. We've established this already. But what number could be the situation where Joe gains more than Jim? Yeah. 0.98? Yeah, somewhere over here. So naturally, that's a very good answer. Naturally, Joe here, this is his threshold amount, and this is where he'd want to be, like getting an infinite amount of gypsum boards per wood. So the furthest you are from the threshold amount, the more you are gaining. If you're in the middle at 0.9, both are gaining a little bit. They're both at a certain distance from their threshold amount. If you're at 0.98, Joe is quite far from his threshold, and Jim is very close to his threshold. That is possible to happen in real life. A lot of people sometimes when they see simple models and examples such as the one that we've just covered in class today, they think it's much too restrictive. But in reality, a lot of the things from real-world situations can be embedded in a very simple scenario. And this idea of one that has more political power than the other or more bargaining power can be illustrated here. But unless someone has a gun to their head or that you have a dictator that's trying to enrich himself and not really doing something good for his country, you will always have a situation where both countries, both companies gain from trading. Okay? So there is benefit from international trade if it's properly done. Globalization is not necessarily bad. But we have to watch out for the people that might not have as much power, might not gain as much. And there might be other things that might go wrong afterwards. Yeah. Any questions? No? So same kind of idea here. It'd be between 0.5 and 3.33, and then an acceptable trading term. If you tell me 1.5, 2, whatever, they all work. But if you say that I have the most bargaining power here, well, I'll be furthest from my threshold, which is 0.5, and closest to 3.33. So it might be a 3-to-1 ratio or whatever. Okay. Any questions? All right. Cool. So I'll leave it to this for today's class. Well, that's fine. The video's done now. I'll leave it to this for today's class. I'll edit that, post it online. If there's anything you have to review and see it. Other weeks you won't see this video, this class probably, unless I screw up Mondays again. But otherwise, feel free to switch classrooms if you prefer Monday or Thursday, or if you want to work from home. Like, you don't have to email me every time. Just come and yeah. Have a good weekend, guys. Don't forget to do the quiz for tomorrow and the pre-week quiz for the Monday morning. It's always going to be for Monday morning for next week. Even though your class is on Thursday, it's always for Monday morning. Okay? Yeah.